With the Shadowlands expansion wrapping up, we figured now would be a good time to discuss the strongest Covenant abilities. Some may have changed a little as the expansion has progressed, but most abilities have been, and still are, far more useful than others. And at number 10, we have Condemn, the Venthyr warrior ability. This ability replaces Execute, a warrior's finishing move, and what makes this ability so strong is that it's usable on targets above 80% health and below 20% health. This ability could additionally be augmented with players' stats, talents, and legendaries, such as Exploiter rune carving power to increase its damage and critical strike. Additionally, Condemn weakened the target's damage output a little bit. Finally, Condemn only has a 6-second cooldown and requires 20 to 40 rage to use, but it can be lower with procs and cooldowns. Condemn is useful in almost all aspects of gameplay, since it enhances a baseline warrior ability. It is most useful in fighting off enemies quickly though, especially in PvP to kill the player before they can heal up. The ability represents one of the major problems with the Covenant system. Despite Blizzard's intention to make all Covenant abilities relatively equal, players will almost always just choose the Covenant that offers them the strongest ability, usually in the form of DPS. There are 12 classes and 4 Covenants, meaning there are 48 unique special Covenant abilities in total, making it ridiculously hard to balance all of the Covenant abilities out. And Condemn was by far the best warrior ability in the beginning of Shadowlands and the Castle Nathir raid, with almost 70% of ARM's inferior warriors using it by extension of being in the Venthyr Covenant. However, it became practically useless after it was heavily nerfed in patch 9.1, Chains of Domination. As of the start of 9.2, the number of warriors choosing Venthyr and thus the ability Condemn had dropped to just 20%, with the Kyrian ability Spear Bastion becoming the most favorable one since it does more AoE damage. These percentages may change, however, come with the addition of double legendaries, as some legendaries are far more powerful than others. Condemn's current low DPS output as of the start of patch 9.2, and its turbulent history place it at the number 10 on this list. While many other abilities could have taken the slot, Condemn is here to show how great it was at the beginning of Shadowlands, and how much it has fallen, as well as to highlight how flawed this system is from being theoretically balanced to overly skewed to one Covenant in reality. And at number 9, we have Flagellation, the Venthyr Covenant ability for rogues. This ability causes some damage to an enemy and then causes each combo point spent during its duration to deal some additional damage afterwards. Flagellation also increases haste by a bit, has a 90-second cooldown, and lasts for 12 seconds. Flagellation was not the most popular Covenant ability at the start of the expansion, and is the opposite of what happened to Condemn. Since Flagellation became much more powerful in later patches, more rogue players switched over to Venthyr. At the beginning of Shadowlands, the best rogue Covenant ability was the Night Fae Covenant ability, called Sepsis, and saw roughly 50% of all rogues being Night Fae. By the start of 9.2, roughly 50% of all rogues were Venthyr. And at number 8 is the Monk Covenant ability from the Necrolords, which is named Bonedust Brew. This is a wide AoE spell which grants a buff to the player over the mobs caught in the spell. The ability has a 40-yard range, and during the period the buff is active, the monk's abilities have a 50% chance to affect the target a second time at 35% effectiveness as shadow damage or healing. This buff lasts for 10 seconds, and the ability has a 1-minute cooldown. For Mistweaver monks, Bonedust Brew, when applied to targets or players, allows for additional healing. Specifically, the Gust of Mist ability heals targets with the Bonedust Brew active for an additional 42%. For Brewmaster monks, Bonedust Brew reduces cooldowns on some abilities by 1 second when using the abilities Tiger Palm and Keg Smash on the affected targets. For Windwalker monks, it has a chance to refund 1 chi when using the Spinning Crane Kick ability. The AoE buff on top of a monk's already impressive AoE damage can be quite a force to be reckoned with, even more so with the AoE cap removed. It is most prominent in the Windwalker DPS spec since it already has a wide range of AoE abilities and talents, including Cyclone Strike, Dance of Chi-Ji, Flying Serpent Kick, Fist of Fury, Storm Earth and Fire, Rushing Jade Wind, and Whirling Dragon Punch. This buff is so powerful for Windwalker monks that at the start of 9.2, nearly 2/3 of all Windwalker monks were members of the Necrolord Covenant. And at number 7, we have Elysian Decree. This is a Demon Hunter ability for the Kyrian Covenant. This 30-yard range spell is essentially an arcane bomb with a fuse of 2 seconds and a cooldown of 1 minute, and it deals 350% attack power damage to all enemies within 30 yards or wherever it's placed. In addition to its damage, Elysian Decree also heals the player for differing amounts depending on the Demon Hunter spec. For Havoc, the purple orb spawned by the ability combined with the passive Shattered Souls can restore 20% health per orb. Additionally, Shattered Souls can grant 30 Fury if the player is talented into Demonic Appetite. For Vengeance Demon Hunters, the healing can be much more variable since it can heal for 6% of all damage taken in the last 5 seconds. The only downside of this ability is that Elysian Decree is soft capped at 5 enemies. Although this spot is for the tank spec for Demon Hunters, we should briefly mention that for Havoc Demon Hunters, which is the DPS spec, that the Night Fae ability The Hunt, as of the beginning of patch 9.2, is the best and most popular Covenant ability with roughly 50% of Havoc Demon Hunters belonging to it. For Vengeance Demon Hunters, Elysian Decree is the best Covenant ability with over 75% of Vengeance Demon Hunters being members of the Kyrian Covenant at the beginning of patch 9.2. This shows just how much damage and healing this ability can do, if 3/4 of the player base for the spec are currently using the ability. 75% is only a slight downgrade from 80% of Vengeance Demon Hunters who were Kyrian towards the beginning of the expansion, showing how little the preference of Covenant and Covenant abilities has changed for Vengeance Demon Hunters. And at number 6, we have the Hunter Night Fae Covenant ability, which is Wild Spirits. This is a massive AoE spell that provides a serious increase in DPS output from up to 40 yards away. First, Wild Spirit applies a 15% damage debuff taken by all enemies in the AoE called Wild Mark. Second, it deals a universal 25% attack power damage to all enemies in the area. Finally, according to the tooltip, each damaging ability the hunter and the pets use against the target in the areas will strike 5 nearby targets for extra nature damage. Although Wild Spirits is soft capped at 5 enemies, you can do even more damage by using the ability aspect of the Wild alongside it. This grants additional 10% crit chance on top of the 15% increased damage taken, making for some serious short DPS bursts. While not too complicated like some of the other Covenant abilities, Wild Spirits is easy to put into a DPS rotation, even if it does have a somewhat long cooldown of 2 minutes. It should also be mentioned that Wild Spirit also applies Hunter's Mark to all enemies caught within it, which can be a great advantage in PvP situations when trying to find the pesky rogue or druid in stealth. At the beginning of Shadowlands, almost 80% of BM Hunters were Night Fae, highlighting just how insanely useful Wild Spirits can be. And as a side note, it's one of the few Covenant abilities that has its own sound. And at number 5, we have Shifting Power, the Mage ability from the Night Fae Covenant. This is an insanely large AoE DPS ability, dealing over 200% spell power damage to all mobs caught within an 18-yard radius over the period of 4 seconds. Additionally, when using Shifting Power, the other Mage ability cooldowns are reduced by 10 seconds. While Mages are a long-distance caster class, Shifting Power is a more medium caster range since it has a shorter effective radius. This means it's not ideal for most Mage specs, and Mages might have to enter melee range in order to properly get the damage in, which is a big downside to the ability. The Fire spec benefits the most from Shifting Power, with other closer melee range Fire Mage abilities like Dragon's Breath and Combustion working alongside Shifting Power very nicely. In patch 9.05, the majority of all 3 Mage specs had joined the Night Fae Covenant. Roughly 75% of Arcane Mages, almost 90% of Fire Mages, and 55% of Frost Mages. As the start of 9.2, things have balanced out a bit except for Fire Mages, which still has nearly 80% of all Fire Mages with the Night Fae Covenant. And at number 4, we have Soul Rot, the Warlock ability for the Night Fae Covenant. Soul Rot is a cooldown ability that applies a damage over time effect to your main target and another dot at about half value to 3 other nearby targets. Drain Life, a baseline Warlock ability, will also steal the health from any enemy affected by Soul Rot and not cost mana. This ability is a massive increase in damage output, and can be cast from up to 40 yards away. However, the cooldown is 90 seconds, the cast time itself being 1.5 seconds, which makes it easily interruptible, especially in PvP. While the extra dot to enemies is nice, it only lasts 8 seconds, meaning you have to get in as many spells as you can while the dot in all enemies is active. In patch 9.05, 80% of Affliction Warlocks were Night Fae, and both Demonology and Destruction had 40% of their players in Night Fae as well. At the beginning of patch 9.2, those numbers had only increased, with almost 85% of Affliction Warlocks choosing Night Fae Covenant, 70% of Demonology Warlocks going Night Fae, and 60% of Destruction Warlocks in Night Fae, meaning the ability is just more popular than ever. And at number 3, we have Divine Toll, the Paladin ability from the Kyrian Covenant. This ability is simple and fun. All it does is replicate an ability onto 5 allies or enemies within 30 yards. Its cooldown isn't that bad at 1 minute, and it only costs 15% of a player's mana. Unfortunately, the abilities that are replicated are only one ability depending on the Paladin spec. For Holy, it replicates Holy Shock. For Protection, Avenger's Shield, and Retribution, Judgment. Additionally, for Retribution, it increases damage by 100% on top of Judgment's 25% increased damage to enemies. Avenger's Shield is also an interrupt and a silence, meaning this is an insane AoE interrupt on Protection Paladin, since it casts 5 interrupts and then each of those interrupts bounce to 2 other mobs, making it a total of 15 interrupts. This could be comparable to the old Blood Elf racial Arcane Torrent, which was a massive AoE that Blizzard removed because they thought it was too overpowered in Mythic Plus dungeons. In 9.05, 85% of Holy Paladins were Kyrian, 77% of Protection Paladins, and 42% of Ret Paladins, showing just how skewed Paladins were overall to the Kyrian Covenant. At the beginning of 9.2, Protection Paladins were still overwhelmingly Kyrian at 79%, and Retribution Paladins had increased to 74%. While not a strict DPS ability for Protection Paladins, the Divine Toll Covenant ability is so unique because it effectively works like a mass interrupt, which can be very useful with the plus trash packs and PvP. And at number 2, we have Abomination Limb, the Death Knight ability granted by pledging allegiance to the Necrolords. This ability has a 20-yard range which grants a 12-second long buff to the player, has a 2-minute cooldown, and essentially acts as both a DPS increase with a combination of Death Grip. Abomination Limb is essentially the same for all 3 Death Knight specs. An AoE damage spell, soft capped at 5 targets and a 20-yard radius from the player, with any enemy within the radius more than 8 yards away from the player having a chance to be pulled towards the player's location. Additionally, the ability grants a specific proc for each spec. For Blood, it grants 3 Bone Shield charges, for Frost, it grants Rime, and for Unholy, it grants Runic Corruption. These procs occur every 6 seconds of the duration of the buff, meaning it procs these abilities twice over the course of the duration of the buff, since it lasts for 12 seconds. In 9.05, nearly 2/3 of Frost Death Knights were Necrolords, and 80% of Unholy Death Knights, showing just how heavily skewed Abomination Limb is compared to other Covenant abilities. As of the start of 9.2, these statistics have remained roughly the same. Blood decays were roughly 50% Venthyr Covenant for the Swarming Mist ability, but it is easy to see that overall, decays are heavily skewed towards the Necrolord Covenant. And at number 1, we have Convoke the Spirits, the Druid ability from the Night Fae Covenant. The ability text reads, "Call upon the Night Fae for an eruption of energy," channeling a rapid flurry of 16 Druid spells and abilities over 4 seconds. It does have a somewhat long cooldown of 2 minutes, however. Technically, this isn't actually an ability, but rather a bunch of player abilities lumped together at once, with a spell being cast once every quarter of a second. Most Druid abilities have a 40-yard range, and as such, so does Convoke the Spirits. The ability will usually favor the Druid's current shapeshifting form, but not always. Convoke the Spirits can theoretically cast 17 Druid player abilities, according to Wowhead. 4 of these abilities are the baseline Druid abilities across all the specs. 2 of these are DPS spells, Moonfire and Wrath, and the other 2 are the healing spells, Rejuvenation and Regrowth. For balanced Druids, Convoke the Spirits can instantly cast Star Surge and Starfall, in addition to the 4 baseline class abilities, meaning it can cast 6 abilities in total. Feral Druids can instantly cast 8 abilities, the additional 4 being Ferocious Bite, Rake, Shred, and Tiger's Fury. Guardian Druids can instantly cast 8 abilities as well, with the other 4 being Mangle, Iron Fur, Thrash, and rarely Pulverize. Finally, Restoration Druids can cast 7 abilities, with the 4 baseline and Swift Mend, Wild Growth, and rarely Flourish. In 9.05, over 91% of balanced Druids were Night Fae. Among the other specs and their Covenant choice, Restoration was 90% Night Fae, Feral was 86%, and Guardian was 73%. These numbers speak for themselves. As of the beginning of 9.2, there were less Night Fae Druids in total, but most of the Druid specs are still around 75% Night Fae. Convoke the Spirits has been such a strong and ubiquitous ability throughout the Shadowlands expansion, and especially at the beginning of the expansion, it's become somewhat of a meme within the WoW community. You can probably expect to see it brought up again in an achievement name, or be the name of a new toy in the next expansion, or maybe even be added to the baseline class. Alright, and that's the video. If you know of any other very strong Covenant abilities that we may have missed, or have ideas for future videos, I'd love to hear about those down in the comments.